Throughout history, there has always been one goal: equal rights and freedom for all. African Americans have been fighting for freedom and equality ever since 1619, when the first slave ship arrived in Jamestown, Virginia. The fight for equality has been especially difficult for the female African American community, who achieved their rights many years after African American males.
Your country, how came it yours? Before the pilgrims landed, we were here. Your country, how came it yours?
The idea of freedom first rose during the Revolutionary War, where the colonists in North America fought for their freedom against the British rule. The early Americans may have been fighting for their liberty, but a large group was left out of their cause: the enslaved women who served their households. African American women were the last group to obtain their full rights. African American women have had the longest fight for freedom and rights, beginning with slavery all the way to fighting for their civil rights. This is a timeline for African American women's strive for the American dream.
Slavery in America began when the first African slaves were brought to the North American colony of Jamestown, Virginia in 1619 to aid the production of such lucrative crops like tobacco. The novel Chains tells the tale of Isabel, a 13-year-old girl who is enslaved by the Loyalists during the Civil War and begins to ask some tough questions about her identity as a result. Chains reveals a side of the revolution that is frequently untold, a more complicated version of this fight than any 4th of July fireworks display has ever been seen. Africans were traded on densely packed ships through the Middle Passage and were transported across the Atlantic to the West Indies. This voyage took 3 to 4 months, and most of the enslaved people laid, with their hands chained to the walls, in rows on the floor or on shelves. There could be up to more than 600 enslaved people on each ship. Captives from different nations were mixed together, so it was more difficult for them to talk and plan rebellions. Women and children were held separately from the men.
Once the enslaved Africans arrived in the Americas, they were often separated from their family and community, unable to communicate with those around them. The Africans were prepared for sale like animals, sold, branded, and issued with a new name. The enslaved Africans were separated and stripped of their identity. Africans were trained to endure their work and conditions. It was a life of endless labor with mental and physical torture. These enslaved people worked up to 18 hours a day, sometimes longer at busy periods such as harvest. There were no weekends or rest days. Many enslaved people rebelled against their owners and fought back in order to gain the civil rights they deserved. The next major event in African American history was the American Civil War, where the Northerners fought the Southern states over issues on slavery. When the anti-slavery Republican Abraham Lincoln was elected, this caused many of the Southern states to secede from the United States. Southern states felt they needed slavery to maintain their economy, but the abolitionist movement was growing in northern states, who claimed slavery was unconstitutional and unlawful. However, because at this time manufacturing and industry was the major source of the economy in the North, the abolition of slavery did not hurt them economically. There were many African American women who made major impacts on the war. However, many went unnoticed and are not frequently discussed. One of these heroines was Susie King Taylor. Born a slave in Savannah, Georgia in 1848, Susie Taylor was 14 years old when the Union Army attacked her town. She fled with her uncle's family to an island off of Georgia, where slaves were being freed if they fought for the Union Army. After it was discovered that she could read and write, they offered her books and materials to see if she could establish a school on the island. She accepted the offer and became the first African American to openly instruct other Americans. By day, she taught children, and by night, she held a class for adults.
Slavery ended in the United States with the passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. Passed by Congress on January 31, 1865, and ratified on December 6, 1865, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery in the United States.
The 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution granted U.S. citizenship to African American men. Attitudes toward the importance of this change split the American Equal Rights Association within the year. The 14th Amendment later became the basis for various equal protection cases advocating for women's rights.
Nearly 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, African Americans still lived in an unequal world of segregation and oppression. Jim Crow laws at the local and state level enforced segregation in classrooms, bathrooms, theaters, train cars, juries, and legislatures. In 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the separate but equal doctrine that formed the basis for state-sanctioned discrimination. Civil rights activists used nonviolent protest and civil disobedience to bring about change, and the federal government made initiatives such as Voting Rights Acts of 1965 and the Civil Rights Act of 1968. Many leaders within the African American community and beyond rose during the Civil Rights era, including Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, Andrew Goodman, Dorothy Vaughan, Catherine Gobel, and Mary Jackson, among others. They risked and sometimes even lost their lives in the name of freedom and equality.
We face the difficulties of today and tomorrow. I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
Where the hell have you been? Everywhere I look, you're not where I need you to be. It's not my imagination. Now, where the hell do you go every day?
To the bathroom, sir.
To the bathroom. To the damn bathroom. For 40 minutes a day? What are you doing there? We're T-minus 0 here. I put a lot of faith in you.
There's no bathroom for me here.
What do you mean there's no bathroom for you here?
There is no bathroom. There are no colored bathrooms in this building or any building outside the West Campus, which is half a mile away. Did you know that? I have to walk to Timbuktu just to relieve myself. And I can't use one of the handy bikes. Picture that, Mr. Harrison. My uniform, skirt below my knees, my heels, and a simple string of pearls. Well, I don't own pearls. Lord knows you don't pay colors enough to afford pearls. And I work like a dog, day and night, living off of coffee from a pot none of you want to touch. So, excuse me if I have to go to the restroom a few times a day.
Imagine being owned by another person and owning nothing for oneself, not even one's name. This is difficult to picture in the 21st century America because most people are fortunate enough to live in a culture where the dividing wall of prejudice has been mostly demolished. The first African American president was elected. Children of all races attend school together, and interracial marriage is no longer seen as a taboo. Although racist attitudes have not been totally eradicated, equality is a much more integral part of our society. It is more important to remember that the things were not always like this, and that these things happening were unthinkable. There was a time when discrimination was socially acceptable and even an economic practice. It is a painful and brutal past to confront. It is important to appreciate how society is today and learn about the mud of the nation's past. The American dream is still just a dream for most minorities. Racism stems from ignorance, and our greatest hope for an equal and tolerant society is continued education and racial integration starting at a young age. Although African American women have surpassed and gained many of the civil rights they fought for, they are still treated as second-class citizens and are not truly living up to the American dream they had once foreseen.
This is the meaning of our liberty and our creed, why men and women and children of every race and every faith can join in celebration across this magnificent mall, and why a man whose father less than 60 years ago might not have been served at a local restaurant can now stand before you to take a most sacred oath.
They'll call it a mystery, but we're gonna call it victory. We'll be writing history. It's gonna be victory. There'll be signs on top of signs, just so you know that history. It's